They called him worthless. They called him nothing. They had no idea who he really was Pod, and in 3 weeks, the President of the United States would say his name in front of the entire country. Every single day, they looked right through him. But 6 years ago, in a place none of them could find on a map, this man 90 seconds. That's all it took for one overlooked man to become the only thing standing between 11 children and disaster. Before I close, there's someone here today I've been wanting to meet for a long time. Is he here with us this morning? 6 years ago, you carried me a mile under fire with a bullet in your own shoulder toe, and you never let go. This country finally needs to know your name.
If you have ever been judged by the way you look instead of the weight you carry, this story is for you. Stay until the end, because what happens to this man in the last 10 minutes will remind you why. Quiet people are often the strongest people in the room. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel, because stories like this one deserve to be seen by more people who need to hear them today. Daniel Reyes pushed the mop bucket down the empty hallway of Millbrook Elementary at 6 in the morning, long before the first bus pulled into the lot. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, humming a tune only tired men and empty buildings ever seemed to hear. He was 34 years old, broad-shouldered, with a short beard that had started going gray at the edges, even though he was not old enough for that yet. His hands were rough, scarred across the knuckles in a way that told a story he never talked about. He wore the same faded gray janitor's uniform every day, name tag crooked, boots scuffed from years of walking floors nobody else wanted to walk. 3 years earlier, Daniel had been a sergeant in the United States Army, a combat engineer who built bridges under fire and disarmed things that were built to kill. Now he swept floors and fixed leaking faucets in a town that barely remembered his name unless something broke. His wife had passed away from an illness 2 years before, leaving him with an 8-year-old daughter named Lily, a mop, a small rented house on Birch Street, and a silence that never quite left the rooms of that house at night. Lily was the reason he got out of bed every morning. She had her mother's eyes, wide and brown, and a laugh that could fill an entire kitchen. She attended the very school where her father worked, and every morning before the other students arrived, she would sit on the front steps with a granola bar, waiting for him to finish the east wing so they could walk in together, hand in hand, like the whole world hadn't tried to make him feel small. Millbrook was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone, and everyone had an opinion about everyone else. At the school gates, the parents clustered together in their pressed coats and shining cars, sipping coffee from paper cups, exchanging updates about vacations and promotions. Daniel stood apart from them, pushing his cart of cleaning supplies, and most mornings, nobody said a word to him at all. It was as if the uniform made him invisible, or worse, made him a reminder of something they didn't want to look at too closely. Carol Whitfield ran the Parent-Teacher Association like it was her personal kingdom. She was polished, sharp-tongued, and never missed an opportunity to remind everyone that her husband owned 3 car dealerships across the county. She had never liked Daniel, not since the day he'd corrected her in a school board meeting about a safety violation in the gymnasium ceiling that the board had been ignoring for months. She called him the janitor, the way other people might spit out a curse word, and she said it loud enough that Daniel always heard it, even when she pretended not to notice him standing there. "I don't understand why a man like that is even allowed near our children," she said one afternoon, not quite under her breath, as Daniel wiped down a cafeteria table nearby. "No offense to the position, but shouldn't there be some kind of standard? Some kind of background that inspires confidence?" Daniel said nothing. He never did. He simply finished wiping the table, folded his rag, and walked away, because he had learned a long time ago that some battles were not worth fighting with people who had never had to fight for anything in their lives. But it wasn't just Carol. It was the way Lily's classmates sometimes whispered about her daddy, who cleaned toilets. It was the school board meeting 2 months earlier, where a councilman had suggested outsourcing janitorial services to cut costs, looking directly at Daniel as he said it, as if his job, his purpose, his entire worth as a human being could be reduced to a line item in a budget spreadsheet. It was the quiet, grinding exhaustion of being underestimated every single day by people who had no idea what he had given up, what he had survived, and what he still carried with him from a war they would never have to think about. What none of them knew, what nobody in Millbrook knew except for Daniel himself, was that 6 years earlier, in a mountain pass in a country most of them couldn't find on a map, Sergeant Daniel Reyes had pulled a wounded young captain out of a burning vehicle during an ambush, carried him nearly a mile under enemy fire with a bullet fragment lodged in his own shoulder, and kept that young officer alive until the medevac arrived. That captain's name was Marcus Whitfield Bennett. Nobody in Millbrook knew that name either, not the way they would soon. Daniel rarely allowed himself to think about that night, but it lived in him the way old injuries live in the body, quiet until the weather changes. He remembered the heat of the burning vehicle at his back, the sound of gunfire cracking off the rock walls of the pass, and the weight of a man twice his size slung across his shoulders as he half ran, half stumbled down a slope of loose stone, praying with every step that his legs would hold. He remembered pressing his palm against the captain's chest to keep him breathing, remembered talking to him the entire mile just to keep him conscious, telling him about a daughter who wasn't even born yet, about a wife waiting back home, about anything that might give the man a reason to keep his eyes open. He had never learned what happened to that captain afterward. Units scattered. Deployments ended. Life moved on, the way it always does for the people who give everything and expect nothing in return. When Daniel left the army 2 years later, it was not because he wanted to. It was because the very thing that made him valuable overseas, his steadiness under pressure, his refusal to leave anyone behind, seemed to have no obvious use in the civilian world once the uniform came off. He applied for engineering positions and heard nothing back. He applied for construction supervisor jobs and was told he lacked the right certifications, despite having built things under conditions those interviewers could never imagine. Eventually, the janitor position at Millbrook Elementary was the only offer that came with steady hours and health insurance for his daughter, and Daniel took it without complaint, because a man who has carried a dying friend a mile under fire does not consider honest work. Beneath him, no matter what anyone else thinks of the job title on his paycheck, the story might have stayed buried forever, if not for what happened on a Tuesday morning in early October, the kind of ordinary morning that changes everything before anyone realizes it. The rain had been falling since midnight, hard and relentless, turning Miller's Bridge Road into a slick gray ribbon along the edge of Millbrook Creek. The elementary school's aging activity bus, the one the district had been promising to replace for 3 years, was carrying 11th, 3rd, and 4th graders back from an early morning field trip to the county museum when its brakes failed on the downhill curve just before the bridge. The driver, a kind older woman named Ruth, who had driven that route for 15 years, felt the pedal go soft under her foot and screamed for the children to hold on as the bus began to pick up speed toward the guardrail and the swollen creek below. Daniel was outside that morning, repairing a drainage grate near the bus loop when he heard the sound, an engine roaring wrong, tires screeching against wet asphalt, and children's voices rising in fear from somewhere down the hill. He didn't think. He didn't hesitate. He dropped his tools and ran faster than he had run in years, cutting through the trees along the shortcut he still remembered from countless mornings walking to work, and he reached the curve just as the bus was sliding sideways toward the rail. What Daniel did in the next 90 seconds would later be described by the county fire chief as the difference between a tragedy and a miracle. Using nothing but a fallen utility pole, his own truck, and the same engineering instincts that had once kept soldiers alive on foreign roads, he wedged the pole beneath the bus's rear axle and threw his truck into reverse, using the tow chain from his glove box to create just enough resistance to slow the bus's pole slide before it reached the rail. It wasn't textbook, it wasn't safe, but it worked. The bus shuddered to a stop 18 inches from the guardrail, 18 inches from the churning water below, with 11 children and one shaking bus driver very much alive inside it. A parent driving behind the bus that morning had captured the last 30 seconds of it on her phone, shaking hands and all, the footage ending with Daniel Reyes pulling children out through the emergency exit one by one, soaked to the bone, blood running down his forearm from a gash he wouldn't notice until hours later, saying the same calm words to each child as he lifted them down. "You're okay. I've got you. You're okay." By that evening, the video had been viewed 2 million times. By the next morning, it was on every local news station in the state. Reporters descended on Millbrook Elementary asking for interviews with the janitor who saved the school bus. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Reyes could not walk down a hallway without someone stopping to shake his hand. Carol Whitfield, to her credit, or perhaps to her shame, was the first to organize a small ceremony at the next PTA meeting, though even then, some of the old condescension lingered in the way she introduced him as our custodian, rather than by his name or his rank. Daniel accepted the applause with the same quiet discomfort he accepted most attention, standing at the back of the room afterward, while Lily beamed at him from the front row, prouder than he had ever seen her. But the story did not end there, because somewhere in Washington, D.C., a senior advisor to the President of the United States was scrolling through the morning briefing when a name in a local news clipping caught his eye. Daniel Reyes, Millbrook, Ohio. Former Army sergeant, the advisor's name was Thomas Alvarez, and he had served as a battalion intelligence officer during the very deployment when Sergeant Reyes had carried a wounded captain a mile under fire. Alvarez remembered that captain's name well, because that captain, Marcus Bennett, was now the Vice President of the United States, and he owed his life to a man the world had briefly and almost accidentally rediscovered on the evening news. Thomas Alvarez walked the clipping straight into the vice president's office that same afternoon. Marcus Bennett had never forgotten the man who saved his life. In the 6 years since that mountain ambush, he had tried more than once to track down Sergeant Reyes through old service records and unit contacts, only to lose the trail each time Daniel moved, first to a different base, then out of the service entirely, then into the quiet obscurity of civilian life in a small Ohio town that had never known what it was sheltering. When Alvarez placed that news clipping on his desk, Bennett read the headline once, then again, and then picked up his phone. "Get me Millbrook, Ohio," he said, "and get me the president." 2 weeks later, Millbrook received word that the President of the United States would be visiting the town as part of a planned tour highlighting infrastructure investment in rural communities, a tour that had, according to the official schedule released to local media, been quietly and specifically rerouted to include Millbrook Elementary School. The town exploded into a frenzy of preparation. Banners were hung. The gymnasium ceiling that had been ignored for years was suddenly repaired within 4 days. Carol Whitfield personally oversaw the ordering of new carpet for the front hallway. Every business on Main Street found a reason to repaint a sign or wash a window that had gone untouched for years. The mayor's office called an emergency meeting to discuss traffic routes and security barricades, and for the first time in a decade, the local paper ran a front-page story that had nothing to do with the county fair. Children practiced a welcome song in music class every morning. Teachers rehearsed seating charts as if the gymnasium floor itself were about to be graded. In the middle of all that noise and polish, nobody thought to ask why a presidential visit to a small town in Ohio would specifically request an elementary school with a leaking boiler and a custodian nobody outside its walls had ever heard of. And Daniel, true to form, never thought to ask either. At home on Birch Street, life did not pause for the excitement gripping the rest of the town. Lily had been struggling quietly with a school project on family history, the kind of assignment that asked children to bring in photographs of grandparents and stories passed down through generations, and she had come home one afternoon in tears because she did not know what to say about a father whose own parents had passed years ago and whose service record was a locked box he never opened at the dinner table. Daniel sat with her that night at the kitchen table under the flickering lamp, and for the first time in a long while, he told her small pieces of the truth. Not the mountain pass, not the blood, but the shape of it, that her father had once worn a uniform and helped people who could not help themselves, that courage did not always look like the pictures in her history books, and that being ordinary on the outside never meant a person was ordinary underneath. Lily wrote her essay that night with a new kind of pride in her handwriting, and though neither of them knew it yet, she would stand in front of that very same gymnasium full of strangers in less than 2 weeks and say those same words out loud for the whole town to hear. Daniel found out about the visit the same way everyone else did, through a memo posted on the staff room bulletin board, and he assumed, as anyone in his position would, that it had nothing to do with him. He spent the 2 weeks before the visit exactly as he spent every other week, mopping floors, fixing the boiler that kept sputtering in the basement, walking Lily to school, sitting with her at the kitchen table each night helping with homework by the light of a single lamp because the overhead fixture in the kitchen had been flickering for months, and he hadn't found the time to fix it. The morning of the visit arrived cold and clear, the kind of crisp autumn morning that made the whole town feel scrubbed clean and hopeful. Secret Service agents had swept the school 2 days earlier. Local police lined the streets. Parents crowded the sidewalks outside the school gates, holding phones aloft, waiting for a glimpse of the motorcade. Inside the gymnasium, students sat cross-legged on the newly repaired floor, teachers standing at the edges, the entire town packed shoulder to shoulder along the walls. Daniel had been assigned, as always, to logistics duty, checking that the folding chairs were set, that the sound system worked, that the heating vents weren't rattling the way they usually did. He stood near the back doors in his gray uniform, half hidden behind a stack of folded tables, when the doors opened and the President of the United States walked in, flanked by agents, trailed by the Vice President, trailed by a wave of applause that rose up from the packed gymnasium like a physical force. The President spoke first about infrastructure, about small towns, about the unseen people who kept America's schools and roads and bridges running every single day, unnoticed and underpaid. It was a good speech, warm and well delivered, the kind that made the local news anchors nod approvingly in the front row. But then the President paused, glanced down at a folded card in his hand, and looked up at the crowd with an expression that shifted from formal to something far more personal. "Before I close," the President said, "there's someone here today I've been wanting to meet for a long time. Someone this country owes a debt it can never fully repay. Is Daniel Reyes here with us this morning?" The gymnasium went silent. Every head turned. Carol Whitfield, standing near the front in her best coat, turned pale as she searched the crowd for the man she had spent years dismissing as nothing more than the janitor. Lily, sitting with her class near the front, shot to her feet, her small hand shooting into the air as if she were answering a question in class. "That's my dad," she called out, her voice cracking with pride and disbelief. "He's right there." A teacher standing near the front row gently placed a hand on Lily's shoulder, and one of the aides, who had read her family history essay just days before, leaned down and whispered something to her. Lily nodded, wiped her eyes, and straightened her small shoulders, the way her father had taught her to stand when she felt nervous. When the President gestured for her to come forward alongside her dad, she walked the length of that gymnasium with her chin held high, past the same classmates who had once whispered about the man who cleaned toilets, past Carol Whitfield's stunned, silent face, and took her father's hand in front of the entire town. Every eye in the gymnasium turned toward the back doors, toward the man in the gray uniform standing half-hidden behind a stack of folded tables, and for one long, suspended moment, Daniel Reyes could not move. The Vice President stepped forward before the President could say another word, walking straight down the center aisle, past stunned parents and wide-eyed children, until he stood directly in front of Daniel and extended his hand. "Sergeant Reyes," Marcus Bennett said, his voice thick with an emotion the whole room could feel even from a distance. "6 years ago, you carried me a mile under fire with a bullet in your own shoulder, and you never let go of me once. I have a wife. I have 2 children. I have this job. I have every single day I've lived since that mountain because of you. I never stopped looking for you, and I am so sorry it took this long to find you." The gymnasium erupted, not into polite applause, but into something raw and overwhelming. Parents crying, teachers crying, children who didn't fully understand what was happening, but understood enough to know that something enormous and true was unfolding in front of them. Carol Whitfield stood frozen near the front, her hand pressed to her mouth, the years of quiet condescension crashing down around her all at once. The president walked forward next, taking Daniel's hand in both of his, and spoke words that would be replayed on every news channel in the country by that evening. Sergeant Reyes, this nation does not always know where its heroes are hiding. Sometimes they're mopping our children's floors. Sometimes they're startnost, standing at the back of the room while the rest of us take the front row seats we didn't earn. Today, on behalf of a grateful nation, I am honored to award you the Presidential Citizens Medal for an act of extraordinary heroism 6 years ago that saved the life of a future Vice President of the United States, and for an act of extraordinary heroism 3 weeks ago that saved the lives of 11 children on a school bus. This country needs to know your name. As the medal was placed around his neck, Daniel finally allowed himself to look toward the front row, toward his daughter, who was crying and laughing at the same time, held tightly by her teacher's arm because she could no longer sit still. He mouthed the words, "I love you," across the gymnasium, and Lily mouthed them back, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Daniel Reyes did not feel invisible. He did not feel small. He felt, for the first time in years, entirely and completely seen. In the weeks that followed, Millbrook changed in ways nobody could have predicted. The school board, the same one that had once discussed outsourcing his job to save money, voted unanimously to name the newly repaired gymnasium after him, the Daniel Reyes Community Hall. Carol Whitfield resigned from her position on the PTA board, quietly at first, then wrote a long public letter of apology that ran in the local paper, admitting that she had judged a man by his uniform instead of his character, and that she hoped Millbrook would learn from her mistake long after she was gone from its committees. Parents who had never once spoken to Daniel in the school hallway now stopped him to shake his hand, though he accepted their gratitude the same way he had always accepted everything, with quiet humility rather than pride. The Department of Veterans Affairs offered Daniel a position leading a new initiative, connecting veterans with civilian training and employment programs, a job that paid more than triple his janitor's salary and would take him across the state, meeting other men and women like himself, people who had given everything in uniform only to come home and feel forgotten. Daniel accepted the position, but he made one request before he did, that the school hire and properly support a replacement custodian, someone who would never be treated the way he had been treated, someone whose name every parent in that building would learn to say with respect from the very first day. Lily started 4th grade that January in a school where her classmates no longer whispered about her daddy who cleaned toilets, but instead asked her, wide-eyed, what it had been like to meet the president, what the vice president's handshake had felt like, whether her father still had the medal, which he did, kept in a small wooden box on the mantel that Lily dusted herself every single week without being asked. The flickering lamp in the kitchen finally got fixed too, though not by Daniel. A local electrician, one of the same parents who had once looked past him at the school gates without a word, showed up, unannounced one Saturday morning, with a new fixture and refused to accept a single dollar for the work. It became a strange, quiet pattern in the weeks that followed. Neighbors showing up with casseroles, with offers to fix the fence, with invitations to dinners Daniel would once never have been asked to attend, not because he had changed at all, but because the town had finally been forced to see the man who had been standing in front of them the whole time. Ruth, the bus driver, retired that spring, but not before writing Daniel a letter that he kept folded in his wallet from that day forward, thanking him for the 90 seconds that gave her 15 more years of grandchildren's birthdays she would have otherwise missed. Marcus Bennett visited Millbrook twice more over the following year, once privately, just to sit at Daniel's kitchen table and eat dinner with him and Lily like an old friend rather than a vice president, and once publicly to help break ground on a new bridge across Millbrook Creek engineered, at Daniel's quiet insistence, with the same kind of reinforced guardrail that should have been there all along. Daniel never talked much about that morning in the gymnasium, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had never done any of it for the recognition. He had built bridges under fire because soldiers needed to cross rivers. He had carried a wounded captain a mile because a man was going to die if he didn't. He had thrown his truck into reverse on a rain-slicked road because 11 children were about to go into a creek. None of it had ever been about being seen. And yet, in the end, being seen changed everything. Not because Daniel needed the validation, but because a town full of people needed the reminder that worth is never measured by a uniform, a job title, or a bank account, and that the quietest person in the room is sometimes the only reason the room is still standing at all. Years later, when people in Millbrook told the story of the day the president came to town, they rarely started with the speech about infrastructure, and they never started with Carol Whitfield's carpet. They started the same way every single time. They started with a man in a gray uniform, standing at the back of the room, being called forward by name, because somewhere far above the small, unkind judgments of a small town, someone with the power to make the whole country listen had never once forgotten what he owed to a soldier who refused to let go. And maybe that is the real lesson buried inside this story, the one worth carrying with you long after the screen goes dark tonight. The world will often decide what you are worth, long before it understands what you have carried. It will look at your uniform, your job title, your bank account, your quiet mornings, and your empty seat at the parent coffee table, and it will draw conclusions that have nothing to do with the truth of who you actually are. But worth was never something other people were qualified to measure in the first place. It was never theirs to give, and it was never theirs to take away. Daniel Reyes mopped floors for 2 years while carrying inside him an act of courage that would, one day, be recognized by the President of the United States, and not one single day of that quiet, unnoticed service was ever beneath him, because real strength has never needed an audience to be real. If this story moved you even a little, if it reminded you that the people around you might be carrying more than you will ever know, share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Leave a comment telling us which part of Daniel's story stayed with you the longest. And if you want more stories like this one, stories about quiet heroes who are finally seen, make sure you are subscribed, because there is another one waiting for you very soon.